The first time I saw Serena after everything the museum's atrium glowed like a lantern glass ceiling, catching the city lights and pouring them over marble floors, and I could hear her before I could see her. That bright, performative laugh sailed ahead of her, the one she used like a key in any room. And then she appeared in a silver dress with a diamond that threw shards of light across the walls. She was so busy playing to the crowd that it took a beat for her gaze to find me, to trace the line of Jonathan's hand resting at the small of my back, to register the ring I wore and the calm in my face. When her eyes met mine, something in her expression snagged, as if she'd stepped on invisible wire. The smile held, but the heat drained from it, and the glass in her hand trembled just enough to catch the chandelier's shimmer. I didn't move toward her. I let the moment breathe, the orchestra bowing into a slow waltz while the room turned in quiet curiosity. Gardenia drifted from a stranger's wrist as she passed, and I remembered how Serena used to borrow my perfume and call it luck. Luck had nothing to do with what was standing in front of her now. Before I take you further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments. And if stories about dignity reclaimed speak to you, tap like and subscribe so I know to bring you more. I was raised in a house where the front door was never locked during the day, where casseroles showed up unannounced and stayed until the grief or celebration was over. And I believed for a long time that love worked like neighborhood watch. You looked out for each other, and the trouble never got inside. I met Adam at 26 during a volunteer build on the south side, both of us sunburned and laughing over crooked drywall, and he said he admired that I could make order from chaos, that I had the patience of an oak tree. Serena came a year later through work, magnetic whip-smart, a woman who never entered quietly, who could dissolve a tense boardroom with a joke and leave with 3 new contacts and a dinner reservation. The 3 of us fit into an easy routine, or I told myself we did my steadiness, Adam's charm, Serena's electricity, a trio that felt like balance. On Sundays, we'd drink coffee on our Lakeview balcony and pretend we could see the lake glittering behind the rooftops, talk about travel we couldn't afford, and make plans anyway. The early years of our marriage lived in small, pleasant rituals. He read the business section while I scrolled grant applications. I oversalted the pasta, and he teased me for it. Serena swept in late to dinner with a story and a bottle of wine she insisted we open immediately. We survived tight months by choosing thrift stores over department stores and celebrating wins that no one else would notice a secured grant, a promotion they said would take 2 more years, an old car that lived to pass inspection. My parents loved Adam because he listened to my father's baseball memories like they were scripture. And my mother once squeezed Serena's hands and told her she was a spark in this world, the phrase that made Serena's eyes go glossy with pride. In those days, I thought there was no harm in letting bright people close. I thought shine made everyone warmer. I learned later it makes some people hungrier. Serena had a way of stepping into our home like it already knew her, dropping her coat on a chair and cutting into a conversation before the last sentence finished, and I rarely minded because I liked the noise of her. She called me Saint Miranda when I stayed late at the office, and Professor when I corrected her grammar, the nicknames wrapped in affection that sometimes pinched and sometimes didn't. She would lean across Adam to steal fries from his plate, and he'd brush salt from her knuckles and tell her to order her own next time, and I would laugh, because that was the script of our friendship. When I bought a new dress for our anniversary, she declared it timeless, then borrowed it for a gala the week after promising to get it cleaned and forgetting until I reminded her twice. I told myself that's what sisters did, shared and forgave, and shared again. I didn't see the line she was testing with a careful toe. Money changed things the way a slow tide changes a shoreline. It looks the same until one day it doesn't. Adam's projects got bigger, his calendar more clipped with late meetings that he called tight timelines, and Serena's clients became glossy names you'd recognize even without their logos. My work stayed in the world of urgent needs and measured wins, which I loved, though I noticed how at certain dinners, men angled their bodies toward Serena's sparkle and toward Adam's prospects, and away from what I did unless I made it easy for them. I learned to take pride in what didn't photograph well: food banks hitting targets in January, a GED student passing on her third try, a landlord signing a fair lease because we showed up with a lawyer and a pastor. There is a steadiness that makes you invisible at parties. There is a steadiness that keeps lives from rolling into the ditch. For a while, I believed that was enough to keep my own life steady too. Our home carried the sounds of a life that was good on paper, podcasts humming from the kitchen, the squeak of our balcony door. Adam's keys tossed in the ceramic bowl Serena gave us, with a note that read, "For every day you'll come home late and make it up with dessert." I kept that note for too long. We hosted friends who admired our view, and the thrifted art I swore was intentional. And when Serena didn't bring a date, she took the seat beside Adam and told me to stop fussing, to sit to rest, to let them take care of me for once. The lamplight made everyone softer in those moments. I remember thinking there are worse problems than being loved too much by your own circle. That thought feels naive to say out loud now, but truth often looks like judgment when it ripens. The first hairline fracture didn't look like danger. It sounded like a joke that landed wrong. We were at a holiday party that December. Warm coats piled in a guest room. A piano player leaning into carols, and Serena slipped an arm through Adam's and said he needed a wife with a thicker skin if he was going to keep climbing. She laughed as she said it, a careless throwaway, and I laughed too, a half-second late, the sound catching on something in my throat like a thread on a nail. On the way home, I told myself I was tired that people who talk for a living forget where the edges are. I folded the feeling into a drawer with gift receipts and told myself I'd return to it later. I did, but not soon enough. The night that changed the temperature of my life didn't announce itself with thunder. It arrived by text with a photo that took too long to load and 4 small words that made my chest go hollow. "Are you okay, Miranda?" The first hairline crack widened faster than I wanted to admit, though. At the time, I tried to explain it away. It came on a bitter February night when snow pressed against the windows and the wind rattled the branches outside. Serena had dropped by without calling, insisting she couldn't stand another evening alone in her apartment. She was wrapped in one of my throws, her legs tucked beneath her as if our living room belonged to her, and Adam poured a second glass of wine before I even asked if she wanted one. They argued about basketball voices rising with laughter that seemed to fill every corner while I sat in the armchair with a book that never left my lap. At some point, Serena looked at me, her grin sharp, and said, "I secretly loved it when they fought." It was meant as teasing, but something lingered in her eyes, something mocking, and I felt the comment stick like a burr under my skin. Later that night, after she finally left with a trail of perfume that clung to my blanket, Adam kissed my cheek lightly before heading upstairs. I lingered in the quiet living room, holding the fabric close, resenting the faint trace of her scent. It felt like proof that something was shifting between us, though I still convinced myself it was only in my head. I folded the blanket carefully and tucked it away, telling myself I would not let a thoughtless moment unravel years of friendship. Her visits became more frequent after that, always framed as innocent excuses. She was in the neighborhood, she needed advice, she had a bad date. Each time Adam welcomed her as though she belonged, pouring drinks or making her laugh with that easy charm of his. I told myself it was loyalty, that he was being kind, that this was what friends did. But the longer I watched them together, the more I felt like an audience member to a play I had never agreed to attend. The day I knew I could no longer dismiss my unease came in the heat of summer. We had finished lunch on the terrace, cicadas humming in the trees and the city moving lazily below us. I went inside for just a moment to fetch dessert, and when I returned, I saw them leaning closer than they needed to. Serena's hand, brushing his knee as she laughed at something he said. It was a fleeting image gone in seconds, but it burned into me. By the time I set the plates down, they were sitting apart again, perfectly casual, their faces arranged into innocence. Serena met my eyes with a brightness too sharp to be natural, and she said I was lucky that men like Adam didn't come around often. I smiled because that was the only response I knew to give, but a weight settled in my stomach. Still, I tried to bury the feeling, convincing myself that trust demanded patience, that suspicion without proof was disloyalty in disguise. Life continued with the same routines, mornings with coffee, evenings filled with news and half-cooked dinners, weekends at brunch. On the surface, nothing changed. Yet beneath it, I carried a quiet unease that wouldn't leave a silence inside me that grew heavier with each passing week. The truth finally clawed its way into the light on an ordinary Tuesday night. Adam had said he was working late again, buried in reports for a client, and I didn't question it. That was the pattern: late nights calls from his office, promises that the weekend would be ours. I poured myself a glass of wine, curled on the couch, and scrolled through my emails. That's when I saw it, a message from a mutual friend who rarely reached out directly. Just 2 words, "Are you okay?" Attached was a photo. My breath caught as the image filled the screen. Adam and Serena sat at a restaurant table. I didn't recognize his hand on hers, their faces bent toward each other in a way no friends leaned. It wasn't just closeness, it was ownership, intimacy, the kind of exchange that didn't need words to explain itself. I stared at the photo until my eyes blurred my chest so tight I couldn't draw air. The caption below felt like salt on raw skin. "I thought you knew." I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her laughing, her hand resting so casually on the man who had once promised me forever. My mind replayed every brunch, every party, every night she lingered too long. All the moments I had brushed aside became glaring signs I could no longer ignore. By morning, I felt like a ghost walking through my own body. I needed proof beyond a photo, something undeniable. That afternoon, I remembered a hotel Adam had mentioned, once a discreet downtown place where his colleagues sometimes stayed for meetings. I drove there with my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles whitened, sitting in the car across the street for what felt like an eternity. Then his car pulled up. Serena stepped out in heels I'd never seen before, her hand sliding easily into the small of his back, as though she belonged there. I followed them inside, my heels echoing too loudly across the marble lobby. The air smelled of citrus and polished wood, and the chandeliers glittered in ways that made the whole scene unbearable. At the elevator, Serena pressed the button, whispering something that made him lean down and kiss her cheek. "My husband," kissing her. They stepped inside the doors, closing between us, leaving me staring at my own reflection in the polished steel. I didn't cry then. The tears came later, after I left unnoticed and drove until the city disappeared behind me. I pulled to the side of a dark road and let the sobs tear through me so violently I could barely hold the steering wheel. Grief, betrayal, humiliation. Every part of me burned with it. But beneath the wreckage of those feelings, something darker stirred. Ray. It was not an accident, not a mistake made in a weak moment. It was deliberate, planned, flaunted. That photograph at dinner, the casual kiss in the lobby, they wanted to be seen. They believed I was too naive, too fragile to do anything but accept it. Days blurred after that, nights spent listening to his footsteps as he came home smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't mine. He kissed my forehead like I was a child, then disappeared into silence. Serena stopped calling, but her absence was louder than her presence had ever been. I told myself I needed clarity before I could confront either of them, but the breaking point came sooner than I expected. I went to her condo one evening, the glass and steel structure cold against the river. She answered the door barefoot, wearing one of Adam's shirts. She didn't flinch when she saw me standing there. Instead, she leaned against the frame as though she had been waiting. "I wondered when you'd figure it out," she said, her smile sharp enough to cut. The words hit harder than any blow. Inside, the proof lay everywhere, 2 half-empty wine glasses on the table, his jacket draped casually over a chair. My voice trembled when I spoke, fury wrapped tight around grief. "You think this is a game?" Her smile deepened, cruel, deliberate. "It's not a game if I've already won." The air seemed to vanish from the room. She stepped closer, her perfume overwhelming her voice, low and conspiratorial. "You never knew how to keep him happy, Miranda. I just showed him what he was missing. I should have screamed. I should have struck her. Instead, I froze, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might break through my chest." Then something shifted. The grief hardened, the pain sharpened, and for the first time, I felt clarity. I left without another word, her laughter following me down the hallway like a taunt. By the time I reached my car, my mind was no longer drowning. It was clear, cold, and steady. That night, the Miranda who trusted too easily died, and the woman who took her place was already planning what came next. I didn't know exactly how, not yet, but I knew this Serena would regret every ounce of arrogance she had poured into those words, and Adam would regret every careless betrayal he thought would never reach the light. And as the city stretched before me, glittering and unaware, I whispered a vow into the silence. This was only the beginning. The weeks that followed blurred together in a haze of routine that no longer belonged to me. I went to work each morning, answered emails, attended meetings, and kept my voice steady even when the weight inside me was unbearable. At night, I came home to a house that felt foreign, filled with Adam's belongings, but empty of his presence. His ties still hung neatly in the closet. His cologne clung faintly to the sheets, but his laughter, the sound I once built my life around, was gone. I moved through those days like a shadow, unseen and untouched, trying to understand how my own home had become a stage for betrayal. Everywhere I turned, proof of Serena lingered. Their photos began appearing on social media, staged at rooftop dinners, charity luncheons, and weekend getaways. Each picture was a knife sharpened by captions that praised them as a power couple, perfect together, radiant with success. I recognized the restaurants, places Adam had promised to take me someday. But now, I saw her wearing the dresses she had once borrowed from me, smiling like she had finally claimed the life she always wanted. I never liked scrolling through those images, but somehow I couldn't stop. They were taunts, each one carefully placed, and I knew Serena was waiting for me to break. But I didn't. I stayed silent. My friends grew uneasy, offering cautious words when they thought I wasn't listening. Some assumed I didn't know, others whispered behind closed doors. The silence I kept unnerved them more than if I had screamed. Silence gave me space to think, to breathe, to feel the fury settle into something colder. The more I withdrew, the more clarity came, until I understood I stood at a crossroad: collapse completely, or rebuild myself into someone neither of them would ever forget. One evening, I sat at my desk, staring at a photograph of me and Serena from years earlier. It was from my wedding day, her standing proudly beside me in lavender as my maid of honor, the smile on her face full of secrets I hadn't yet learned to read. My hands trembled as I touched the frame, remembering how she clasped my bouquet before I walked down the aisle, whispering promises of lifelong friendship. The irony seared through me. How poetic that the woman who had witnessed my vows would become the reason I broke them. It was in that quiet moment I realized grief was no longer the heaviest thing I carried. What weighed most was rage, and rage could be shaped. I began to watch her carefully, not in ways that would draw attention, but with the patience of someone who had nothing left to lose. Serena was careless, and power made her sloppier. She flaunted Adam like an accessory, but I noticed the way she tugged too tightly at his arm during photos, how his smile looked strained in the background, while hers flashed brilliantly in front. She burned through money on clothes, on dinners, on vacations, each one designed to remind the world she had finally arrived. But beneath the polished cracks showed debts whispered about favors she owed to people who didn't forget easily. I memorized every detail, not yet knowing how I would use them, but certain the time would come. The loneliness I felt in those months was a strange kind, not the absence of company, but the absence of belonging. My days passed among people, colleagues, and acquaintances, but I felt detached from all of it, watching life as though it belonged to someone else. At night, I lay awake in the bed I once shared with Adam, staring at the ceiling, the faint glow of city lights pressing through the curtains. The pain was sharp at first, then dulled into a constant ache, a reminder of what had been stolen from me. But slowly beneath the ache, something harder grew, steel forming where softness had been. It was during one of those hollow afternoons that I ducked into a small cafe downtown, hoping the buzz of strangers might drown out the thoughts in my head. I ordered coffee and sat at a corner table, content to lose myself in the hum of voices and clinking of cups. That was when he appeared, Jonathan Pierce. He asked if he could share my table, the cafe, too crowded for solitude. I looked up, and in that instant, I sensed a presence I couldn't ignore. His posture was deliberate, his gaze steady, the kind of man who carried authority without needing to announce it. We began with small talk, polite exchanges about the weather and books. But beneath it, I felt him studying me with the same sharpness I found myself using on others. By the end of that hour, I knew two things with startling certainty. Jonathan was a man who understood power, and he could recognize it in others. It wasn't romance, not then, and it wasn't rescue. It was recognition. He saw the edges I had only begun to sharpen, and he didn't look away. That night, lying in my empty bed, I understood something with a clarity that startled me. I would not heal quietly, nor would I forgive. Serena had stolen my husband and paraded him around as proof of her triumph. But what she didn't understand was that her hunger would always be her weakness. She envied everything I once had, and envy blinds people to danger. I whispered a vow into the silence one even the walls of my home seemed to hear. I would take from her what she valued most: her pride, her status, her illusion of victory. The grief that had once kept me paralyzed now fueled me. Every photo she posted, every laugh she shared with Adam became sparks, feeding the fire inside me. I no longer recognized the woman I used to be, the trusting, loyal, naive version of myself. She was gone, replaced by someone colder, someone willing to wait. The decision wasn't born of rage alone. It was born of patience. Revenge, I realized, wasn't about noise. It was about architecture. You build it carefully, brick by brick, until the structure towers high enough to collapse on its target. And so, I began building. Quietly, steadily, with every detail I collected, with every introduction Jonathan offered, with every memory of Serena's carelessness, I tucked away like ammunition She thought she had won, that I was finished, that she had buried me beneath her laughter. She had no idea I was already laying the foundation for her fall. I ended each day with the same ritual. Standing before the mirror, smoothing my hair, I would whisper the words that became my mantra. You ended my marriage, Serena. I'll end your empire. What I didn't yet know was how much Jonathan would come to shape that vow. How much his presence would sharpen my resolve. But as the city lights flickered across the glass, I felt the first quiet stirrings of something dangerous and alive. And in that silence, I knew the game had only just begun. Jonathan and I began crossing paths more often at first by chance than by design. He would call to ask if I wanted company for coffee or invite me to dinners where introductions mattered more than the menus. Sitting across from him, I noticed how people shifted when he entered a room. Conversations adjusted, laughter softened, and eyes followed. He carried the kind of authority that couldn't be bought with money alone. With him, I felt both steadied and sharpened, as though the steel I had been forging inside myself had finally met a mirror. We never spoke of romance in those early days. Our connection grew out of unspoken recognition, two people who understood the cost of silence and the value of patience. He asked me once, after I had told him carefully chosen pieces of my story, if I was the type to let betrayal go unanswered. I held his gaze and said I wasn't. What I didn't say was that betrayal had already rewritten me into someone unrecognizable. He nodded, a slow smile forming, and told me patience sharpens every blade. That sentence stayed with me, echoing through nights when sleep eluded me. I learned quickly that Jonathan wasn't only wealthy, but deeply connected. His name opened doors into the circles Serena had been clawing her way toward for years. The first time he brought me to a gala, I noticed the shift immediately. People who had once glanced past me now leaned in, eager to know who I was, eager to be remembered by him. Standing at his side, I wasn't invisible anymore. I was someone to be noticed, someone to be respected, and I carried that newfound attention like armor. In those rooms, I watched Serena from a distance. She floated through conversations with her practiced smile, Daniel trailing behind her, offering polite nods, but little else. I saw the strain in the way she touched his arm too tightly, as though holding him in place. Her laugh rang louder than it once had, almost brittle. She worked so hard to project control, but control is fragile when built on envy. And envy was the thread I intended to pull. While Jonathan guided me through the social terrain, I began mapping Serena's patterns with deliberate care. I learned where she lunched, who she courted for favors, and which committees she begged to join. I noted the boutiques where she spent freely, the champagne deliveries that arrived at her building, and the debts she carried quietly in the background. It wasn't enough to strike yet, but it was enough to know where the cracks lay. I wrote it all down at night, details scribbled into a leather journal I kept hidden each page, another brick in the structure I was building. At the same time, I reshaped myself. I updated my wardrobe not with extravagance, but with precision pieces that carried confidence without shouting. I began volunteering at charities that mattered to me, letting the right people see my face and remember my name. Whispers of my return spread through the city, not as the discarded wife Serena wanted me to be, but as someone stronger, sharper, and more present than ever before. No matter how many designer gowns she bought, Serena couldn't mimic what came naturally when I stood in those rooms, with Jonathan at my side. The second layer of my plan was leverage. Jonathan's connections unearthed what Serena thought she had concealed: overdrawn accounts, favors she owed to people who were growing impatient, and lines of credit stretched dangerously thin. She burned money to keep her image polished, but cracks widened beneath the surface. She didn't know it yet, but her own carelessness was writing the story of her downfall. I didn't rush it. I kept watching, letting the pieces arrange themselves until the picture grew sharper. Timing mattered. If Serena had stolen Adam in public, flaunting him as proof of her conquest, then her undoing had to be just as public. I couldn't settle for whispers behind her back or quiet scandals that would be dismissed by morning. No, her collapse needed to be undeniable, witnessed by the very people she worked hardest to impress. It needed to leave her alone at the center of a room with no one left willing to stand beside her. Jonathan and I spoke of this often in his penthouse, the city lights sprawling beneath the windows like stars within reach. One evening, after pouring me a glass of wine, he leaned back and told me the structure was built. All that remained was to let it fall. I looked out at the skyline, every tower lit against the night, and knew he was right. I had been patient, deliberate, and careful. Now it was time to step into the role Serena had unwittingly cast me in, not the victim, but the reckoning she never saw coming. I slipped the ring Jonathan gave me onto my finger one evening and let the weight of it settle into my bones. It wasn't only a symbol of marriage, but of strategy, of alliance, of a vow to rebuild myself into someone Serena could never overshadow. I thought back to the vow I had once whispered into the mirror that I would end her empire. That night, it no longer felt like a whisper. It felt like a promise already kept. The stage was nearly set. Serena had no idea she was walking straight into the trap I had been building for months. And as I prepared for what was to come, I felt the fire inside me quiet into something colder, something steadier. Revenge wasn't rage anymore. It was inevitability. What Serena didn't realize was that the night of her undoing had already been chosen, and she was already standing in the center of it. The gala season arrived with all its glitter and expectation, and Jonathan made sure we chose carefully where we appeared together. It wasn't about being seen often. It was about being seen precisely. When we entered a room, we did so at the right moment, late enough that eyes turned, early enough that whispers began. His hand resting at the small of my back was a quiet signal, and I could feel the shift each time. People wanted to know me now. They wanted to remember my name, and I let them. Serena noticed before she understood. I saw it in the way her smile faltered the first time we crossed paths at a benefit dinner. She wore a dress the color of embers, bright enough to demand attention. But her gaze darted toward me when Jonathan pulled out my chair and touched my shoulder with deliberate ease. For a second, her composure cracked, but she recovered quickly, laughing too loudly at something someone said near her. I watched from across the table as she leaned into Daniel, gripping his arm tightly, as though trying to anchor herself in a storm she couldn't name. Jonathan leaned close to me that evening, his voice low. "She doesn't realize yet, does she?" I answered softly. "Not yet. But she will." It wasn't a boast. It was certainty. The seed of doubt was already planted in her, and I knew it would grow. I began cultivating allies quietly. There were people in those circles who had tolerated Serena because of Daniel's money or her relentless ambition. But tolerance doesn't last when a stronger alternative appears. Over glasses of wine or in quiet corners, I dropped truths that needed no embellishment. Her recklessness with money, her hunger for recognition, the way her marriage looked hollow when no one else was watching. I didn't spread lies. I didn't have to. People are quick to believe the worst when envy already lives in them. Serena, in her desperation, only fueled my work. She spent more flaunted, more demanded, more attention from those already growing weary of her performance. Every new display was another step into the trap. Jonathan watched with quiet approval, offering introductions and opening doors. I played my part with a smile gracious but deliberate, knowing every gesture was another stroke in the portrait I wanted her to see when the curtain finally lifted. The night that crystallized my intent came when Jonathan and I sat high above the city in his penthouse. The skyline stretched across the windows like a promise. He poured me wine, his movements measured his eyes, never leaving mine. "You've built the foundation," he said. "Now it's time to decide how the walls fall." His words weren't a question. They were an invitation. I nodded, feeling the weight of months of silence and patience harden into resolve. I understood then that revenge wasn't about screaming or striking out in anger. It was theater. It required precision timing and an audience. Serena had stolen my husband under the eyes of our friends and flaunted it in public. Her undoing had to be just as visible. She needed to be exposed where whispers couldn't soften the blow, where silence couldn't protect her. The final plan began to take shape. Jonathan hosted the kind of fundraisers Serena longed to attend, the kind that secured her place in the magazines she clipped and tucked away. We made certain she would be present at the one that mattered most. Invitations arrived at her doorstep with gold lettering, the kind of detail she could never resist. She didn't know the stage she dreamed of standing on was the one we were preparing for her collapse. In the weeks leading up to it, I refined every detail. My dress was chosen carefully elegant, without excess, a shade that commanded attention without begging for it. Jonathan and I rehearsed the timing of our entrance, the introductions we would allow, and the subtle moments that would draw the room's gaze toward us. Nothing would be left to chance. The night of the fundraiser arrived, with chandeliers glittering champagne towers rising in the atrium, and the city's most powerful gathering beneath one roof. Cameras flashed at the entrance, and the orchestra filled the air with music that carried like a tide. We arrived late enough that our presence turned heads, and I felt Serena's eyes on me before I saw her. Her smile stretched too wide, her laughter edged with panic. She clung to Daniel as though he were proof she had not lost, but his face told another story. His smile was tired, his posture strained. Even he seemed weary of the performance. We crossed paths near the silent auction tables, and she stepped forward, her voice pitched too high. "Miranda," she said, pretending surprise. "What a surprise to see you here." I smiled calmly, answering with a softness that carried sharper than any blade. "You look desperate." Her eyes flickered, her mask trembling, but she forced a laugh. "Jealousy isn't a good look on you." Jonathan leaned close, his hand brushing my back. "She's not jealous," he said evenly. "She's victorious." The words hung heavy in the air, and I watched her composure falter. Those around us caught it, their glances narrowing, their whispers beginning. Exactly as planned. Dinner followed, and we were seated at the head table, the very place Serena had begged for, but been denied. I could see the tension in her jaw as toast after toast excluded her name. When Jonathan introduced me to the mayor, she nearly choked on her wine. Her facade was slipping, and I knew the moment of collapse was drawing near. The evening was choreographed, and Jonathan delivered the final stroke. After dessert, he stood at the podium, commanding the room with ease. He spoke briefly about the cause, then extended his hand to me. "My wife and I are proud to support tonight's work," he said. The word wife sliced through the air. Gasps rippled, cameras flashed, and I watched Serena's face pale as her fork slipped against her plate with a sharp clang. The whispers swelled around her, the confusion on Daniel's face deepening. She tried to speak, but her words tangled in panic. The room was no longer hers. It belonged to the truth we had orchestrated. And as I stood beside Jonathan, hand in his, I felt the fire inside me steady into something colder, more enduring. Serena thought she had stolen my life. What she never realized was that she had been building the stage for her own downfall. The curtain had only just begun to rise, and her unraveling was already underway. The word wife still hung in the air when Jonathan lowered his hand, and the weight of it seemed to press against every corner of the ballroom. The room's stilled silverware paused midair, and whispers rippled through the guests like a wave breaking against the shore. I could feel Serena's eyes locked on me wide with disbelief, her lips parting, but no sound coming out. Daniel shifted beside her, confusion clouding his face, glancing between us as though he had missed the first half of a play and couldn't catch up to the story. Jonathan's grip was steady around mine. His smile controlled his tone even as he continued to thank the hosts for the evening. But I could sense the room had already shifted. People weren't listening to his words anymore. Their focus had moved as though the spotlight itself had turned. Serena tried to lift her glass, but her hand shook the stem clinking against the plate before her. I saw the quick flush rise to her cheeks, and I knew the unraveling had begun. The auctioneer stepped back to the stage, filling the silence with numbers and bids, but the attention didn't return. Eyes darted toward Serena and Daniel, curiosity mingled with judgment. She forced her lips into a smile, turning to whisper something to him, but I could see his jaw tighten as he pulled his arm from her grasp. His patience was thinning not because of me, but because he suddenly realized the mask she had built around them was cracking where everyone could see. When dessert was served, Jonathan excused himself to speak with the mayor, leaving me at the head of the table. I leaned back in my chair, my fingertips resting lightly on the linen as I caught Serena watching me from further down. Her smile quivered at the edges, her eyes flashing with something between fury and fear. I tilted my head, offering her the smallest of smiles, and she looked away quickly, reaching for her glass again. The tremor in her hand betrayed her, though she tried to laugh at something the woman next to her had said. The moment of exposure arrived sooner than I expected. Jonathan returned to the stage, calling for attention, as the light softened and a projector screen flickered to life behind him. Images filled the canvas in quick succession, photos of Serena and Adam at restaurants, hotel lobbies, quiet corners of bars. Time-stamped receipts followed details that couldn't be denied. The crowd gasped, some voices rising in murmurs, others falling into silence. Serena rose abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "This is a lie," she said, her voice breaking. "All of it. Lies." She reached for Daniel's arm, desperate now, but he didn't move to steady her. Instead, he pushed his chair back, slowly standing with a look of dawning humiliation on his face. "Serena," he said, his voice trembling, "what is this?" The room fell quiet again. All eyes were on them, not on me, not on Jonathan. This was their stage now, and their collapse was unfolding without a single hand raised against them. Serena's protests grew frantic, her words tangled. "Daniel, you know this isn't true. They've twisted everything. Please, you know me." But he didn't answer. His face, pale and drawn, said more than words could. He turned away, and that small, deliberate movement sealed her isolation. She had wanted the room's attention. Now she had it, but not in the way she imagined. I rose from my seat, my voice calm, but carrying across the silence. "It's strange, isn't it, how betrayal always finds its way back?" I didn't look at her directly, but the words landed, and I could see the blow register in her eyes. The orchestra began again, as though trying to restore the evening's rhythm, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Serena sank back into her chair, her hands trembling, her eyes darting toward the exit she didn't yet have the courage to take. Jonathan joined me, his hand brushing mine lightly as cameras flashed, capturing every detail, the poised man, the woman at his side, and the unraveling of the one who thought she had already won. Serena finally stood, her heels striking the marble as she fled, her face pale beneath the chandeliers. Daniel followed a step behind, but his expression was hollow, and he didn't reach for her. The doors closed, and the night swallowed them. I lifted my glass as though nothing had happened, and Jonathan leaned toward me, his voice low enough for only me to hear. Satisfied, I let my gaze linger on the room now buzzing with whispers, and answered softly, almost. The fallout began the very next morning. The newspapers didn't print her name directly, but everyone knew. Phrases like a prominent socialite and an affair laid bare were enough to send her reputation into freefall. Invitations she once flaunted vanished. Messages went unanswered. Photos she had begged to appear in were quickly deleted by those who didn't want her shadow touching their names. I didn't look for Adam in any of it. He was collateral swept away in the same tide that drowned her. He hadn't fought for me when it mattered, and by the time Serena left him, humiliated, he was little more than a bystander in his own downfall. Let him carry his silence. It was the weight he chose. But Serena wasn't built to fade quietly. 2 weeks later, she appeared at Jonathan's office, sunglasses hiding the circles under her eyes, her voice raised at the receptionist. I watched from the corner of the glass wall as she pushed her way inside. Her hair disheveled, her lipstick smeared, her anger trembling with desperation. She pointed at me first, then at Jonathan. You planned this. The gala, the photos, all of it. You set me up. I didn't flinch. No, Serena. You did that yourself. Her chest rose and fell quickly, her breaths shallow. You don't have that kind of power, Miranda. You never did. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. His voice was calm, deliberate. She didn't not alone. But with me, you were never as clever as you thought. The words struck her harder than anything I could have said. She looked between us, realization dawning slowly, her bravado faltering. You knew, she whispered from the beginning. Jonathan's smile was cold, steady. Before the beginning. I stepped forward, my heels sharp against the floor, and stopped only inches from her. You wanted my life so badly, Serena. Now you are me, discarded, forgotten, replaced. Her eyes brimmed, but the tears never fell. Pride held them in place, the last fragile shield she carried. She turned toward Jonathan in one final plea. You can't really stand with her. Not after everything. You can't. His reply was ice. I don't stand beside women who destroy. I stand beside women who build. And Miranda has built every piece of this. The silence that followed was her sentence. No shouting, no accusations, only the quiet truth that nothing remained for her here. She stumbled back, fumbling for her sunglasses, and left without looking over her shoulder. The hallway echoed with the uneven sound of her heels until it faded completely. Jonathan rose and came to my side, his hand brushing lightly against mine. Now he asked again, "Are you satisfied?" I looked out the window at the city stretched beneath us, its towers gleaming in the afternoon light. For the first time in years, I felt whole. Not satisfied. Finished. And as I stood there, the weight of silence no longer mine to carry, I knew her empire had crumbled for good, but my work was not yet complete. The reckoning had only begun to settle, and the lessons of betrayal were still unfolding. The weeks after Serena stormed out of Jonathan's office felt like a second kind of silence, this one not mine, but hers. The city that once echoed her name now pretended not to remember it. Invitations disappeared. Committees she had clawed her way onto suddenly postponed meetings she was no longer welcome to attend. Friends she flaunted at parties quietly deleted photographs that once displayed her on their arms. The woman who had built her identity on being envied was now shunned, her name whispered only in the context of scandal. I heard pieces of it everywhere without ever needing to seek them. At luncheons, someone would mention an unpaid bill at a boutique she once frequented. At a charity event, I overheard a board member sigh that they had overestimated her reliability. Even in casual conversations, I caught fragments of her unraveling her temper in public, her missed appearances, her increasingly frantic attempts to hold on to what was already gone. I didn't need to add to the gossip. The fire had already spread. I had only lit the match. Daniel's decline was quieter, but just as visible. Without Serena's relentless push, he seemed diminished, a man without direction. I heard he moved into a smaller apartment, that his work had begun to falter. People who once laughed at his stories now avoided his company. He had been her trophy displayed proudly, and now without her, he was just a reminder of choices that ended badly. I never reached out. My heart no longer carried his name. He was part of the wreckage I had left behind, and I felt no pull to look back. One evening, Jonathan and I attended a dinner hosted by a local foundation. The chandeliers cast warm light across polished tables, and conversation flowed like music. Across the room, I caught sight of Serena standing near the entrance. She wore black, her figure thinner than before, her shoulders hunched as though she hadn't meant to be seen. Her eyes darted toward me, then away quickly, and I knew she had not expected me to be there. For a moment, I saw the echo of the woman who had once strutted into every room with certainty. Now she lingered at the edges, waiting for a kindness no one offered. She left before dessert was served, her heels clicking unevenly against the marble floor. No one followed her. No one called after her. I sat back, sipping my wine, the taste rich and steady, and felt the weight of her departure settle over me like closure. The city had rendered its judgment. Her empire wasn't only gone, it had been erased. Jonathan reached for my hand as the evening wound down. His thumb brushed lightly across my knuckles, and he leaned close. "She won't recover from this," he said softly. "She's finished." I nodded, though I already knew. Watching Serena crumble wasn't about whether she would rise again. It was about showing her and myself that I was no longer the woman she thought she had destroyed. Yet I also understood something new in those weeks. Revenge delivers justice, but it doesn't fill silence. My days grew lighter, yes, but there were still mornings when I woke with the memory of what had been stolen, and nights when the ache of betrayal lingered like a shadow. Jonathan never pressed me to move faster than I could. He offered steadiness, not rescue. He reminded me through his actions that what I was building now belonged entirely to me. One afternoon, we walked along the lakefront, the autumn air sharp with the scent of leaves and water. Families passed with children bundled in scarves. Joggers moved steadily along the path, and the city's skyline rose behind us. Jonathan paused, watching the water, and said quietly, "You've taken back what she stole. Now what do you want to build?" His words stayed with me long after, not as a question of strategy, but as a reminder that my life was mine to shape. Serena tried one final maneuver not long after. She appeared unannounced at a luncheon where she was no longer invited, forcing her way into conversations that folded around her like closed doors. I saw her across the room, her smile trembling, her laugh sharp as glass. When our eyes met, she froze, her face paling as though she had been caught trespassing. I didn't speak to her. I didn't need to. She left within minutes, her presence as fleeting as the reputation she once protected so carefully. After that, she vanished completely. Her name faded from conversations, her face disappeared from events, and even the gossip columns no longer found her worthy of ink. The silence she left behind was different from the silence she had forced on me years before. Mine had been the silence of pain. Hers was the silence of erasure. One evening, standing at the window of Jonathan's penthouse, I looked out at the city below, the streets glowing with light, and realized the battle was no longer mine to fight. Serena had been reduced to nothing more than a memory whispered at parties, a cautionary tale of arrogance and betrayal. I had taken back my dignity, my voice, and my place. Jonathan stepped beside me, his presence warm and steady, and asked, "Are you ready to close this chapter?" I turned toward him, the reflection of the city caught in the glass, and answered softly, "Yes, it's time." But even as I said it, I knew I had one final reflection left, not about Serena or Daniel, but about myself. The woman who had once endured betrayal in silence was gone. In her place stood someone who had rebuilt from the ruins, someone who understood patience, strength, and the quiet power of justice. And as I prepared to step fully into that new life, I felt the story of my betrayal reaching its true conclusion, where vengeance was no longer the centerpiece, but the foundation for something lasting. The end was near, and it would not be defined by her downfall alone. It would be defined by the dignity I had reclaimed. When Serena finally disappeared from the city's gatherings, it was as though a storm had passed, leaving the air clear and the streets washed clean. Her name no longer carried weight. It carried only silence. Daniel faded too, retreating into the shadows he had once stepped out of so confidently. Their absence did not leave a hole in my life. It left space to breathe, to build, to feel whole again. For the first time in years, I could walk into a room without carrying the heaviness of betrayal on my shoulders. Jonathan stood beside me through it all, not as someone who rescued me, but as someone who recognized the steel I had forged in myself. Together, we became a presence Serena had always craved, but could never sustain a partnership built on steadiness, not desperation. When we were introduced as a couple at events, I saw in people's eyes that they didn't just see me as Jonathan's wife. They saw me as myself again. And that quiet recognition mattered more than all the whispers that had once torn at me. Looking back, I realized that revenge was never about destruction alone. It was about reclaiming dignity in a world where it had been stripped away. Every step I took from silence to strategy reminded me that strength is not found in shouting, but in patience. Serena had thought she buried me under her triumph. What she never understood was that betrayal often plants the seeds of something stronger, something she could never touch. I no longer think often of the photos I once stared at until my eyes blurred, or the hotel lobby where I saw my husband kiss my best friend. Those images are still there, etched in memory, but they no longer cut. They are reminders of a life I outgrew, of a self I left behind. The woman I am now carries those scars, but she carries them as proof of survival, not defeat. The lesson I took from all of it is simple. You cannot control the cruelty of others, but you can choose what you build from it. Betrayal taught me patience, clarity, and above all, the importance of never letting someone else define my worth. Serena wanted me to collapse so she could stand taller. Instead, I rose and she vanished. That was justice, not in fury, but in dignity. Now when I stand at the window of our home and look out at the city lights, I don't think about what I lost. I think about what I reclaimed. My voice, my place, my peace. Serena became a cautionary tale whispered at dinner parties. I became the woman who endured, who waited, and who rebuilt. And that difference in the end was everything. Before we close, I'd love to know, has there ever been a time when silence gave you strength, when patience carried you through betrayal? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if these stories speak to you, stay connected here.